Thank you very much, Mary Frances. So yes, as Mary Frances was saying, I'm going to start looking at the data on a more sectoral basis. But first of all, just to recap, I suppose, on where the overall emissions are looking based on our projections. So this figure shows the projections for with existing measures and with additional measures out to 2030, and this includes LULUCF. So to reach our 51% target, we need to reduce emissions to just over 30 billion tonnes. At the moment, in the WAM, the emissions are landing at 48 million tonnes. So just even with all of the government plans implemented, there's still quite a significant gap. So if we were to look at, I suppose, where the sectors are in proportion to each other across the economy. So in the energy industries, we can see that there has been that it's projected to be a decrease in terms of the proportion. So in 2022, energy industries, which is mainly electricity generation, accounted for 16% of our overall emissions. That's from our 2022 inventory data. And in 2030, in both the with existing measures and with additional measure scenarios, this is set to reduce to 7 and 8%. So energy industries continuing to reduce as a portion of overall emissions. In terms of the residential emissions and transport emissions, it's quite static across the forecast. We do see some areas as well that are increasing. For example, agriculture in 2022 is 36% of our overall emissions, but in 2030 and in the WAM scenario, it increases to up to 40%. LULUCF is also increasing. It's 6% in the 2022 inventory, but it's increasing to 13% in the WAM scenario and 10% in the WAM scenario. So to look now at the emissions sector by sector, so we'll start with agriculture, and just to, I suppose, explain from for the next series of graphs, the percentages that I'm referring to are comparisons between the 2022 inventory and the 2030 projected WEM and WAM scenarios. So we're not looking back at the 2018 start point, we're looking at a start point of the inventory. So for agriculture, in the WEM scenario, we see a reduction of 1% from 2022 to 2030. So this is slightly lower than last year in terms of our WEM reduction, and that reduction is that I suppose reduction in emission savings is due to an increased fuel use in the agriculture sector from the inventory data that we've received. But the measures that are included in WEM include low emission slurry spreading as per the Nitrates Action Programme and a target for lime application of 2 million tonnes per annum by 2030. In the WAM scenario, then we see a much higher reduction of 18% between 2022 and 2030. And in the WAM scenario, the measures from the Climate Action Plan are included. So these include caps in fertiliser sales at 330 kilotonnes by 2030, increased adoption of protected urea, and a range of methane reduction measures as per the Climate Action Plan. For transport then, in the WEM scenario, we see a reduction of 5% from 2022 to 2030. The main measures included in the WEM scenario are related to biofuel blends and the move to electrification of our vehicle fleet. So for the WEM scenario then, we have a 10% biofuel blend in petrol by 2030 and 12% for diesel. And in the WEM scenario, our EVs meet almost 700,000 EVs by 2030. In the WAM scenario, then there's three main assumptions or three main measures. For again, the blends, but in this case, the diesel blend increases to 20% by 2030. Petrol remains at 10%. In our projections, we've included hitting the full EV target of 945,000 EVs by 2030. And we also include the avoid shift measures in Climate Action Plan 2024. With a small change in comparison to last year, which removes the fuel price measure. And this measure was a measure that was used in modelling for Climate Action Plan, and it was never intended to be a policy. So this hasn't been included this year. Next, we move on to the energy industries, which is mostly made up of electricity generation. So in this sector, the reductions in terms of emissions are very similar between WEM and WAM. So we see a 57% reduction in emissions in the WEM scenario and a 62% reduction in the WAM scenario. In the WEM scenario, we hit renewable energy targets of almost 70% by 2030. And we also see the introduction of the Greenlink and Celtic interconnectors. So they're coming online in 2025 and 2027, respectively. In terms of the WAM scenario then, 62% reduction, and this accounts for an 80%, hitting our 80% target of renewable energy by 2030. So that target is set out in the Climate Action Plan. It also includes some additional interconnections. Looking at the emissions from the residential sector then, so we see a 15% reduction in the WEM and a 27% reduction in the WAM scenario. In terms of the measures that are included under the WEM scenario, we see domestic heat pump uptakes based on funding that is currently in place, so no increased funding, just a continuation of the current levels of funding. The input assumptions include an effective ban or no more oil boilers or gas boilers from 2022 or 2025 in new homes. But we actually received updated information from the Department of Housing yesterday, and the gas boilers have already been removed from new buildings. So there's no further gas boilers in new buildings from 2023. We also see in the WAM scenario expected completion of 2 district heating schemes, and they have a combined capacity of 0.075 terawatt hours by 2030. In the WAM scenario then, so we see a boosting in terms of the number of heat pumps. So it's 680,000 heat pumps in total, and this includes 400,000 heat pumps to be retrofitted in existing homes. We also see higher levels of district heating. The Climate Action Plan has a 2.7 terawatt hour target for district heating, and this is split across the residential sector and the commercial and the commercial and public services sector. So there's 1.2 terawatt hours allocated to the residential sector. Looking to manufacturing combustion then, so this is the energy required for our industry, so it's normally associated with heat requirements. We see a 12% reduction in the with existing measures scenario and a 32% reduction in the WAM scenario. So in the existing measures, we see further implementation of energy efficiency programs, such as SEAI's large industry program. In the WAM scenario, then the main reason for the jump, I suppose, in emissions reductions between WEM and WAM is the addition of biomethane use across the heat sector. So it's 5.7 terawatt hours in total in the Climate Action Plan, and this is split between manufacturing, combustion, and commercial and public services. So a portion goes to each sector. So looking to commercial and public services now, we see a 19% reduction in the WEM scenario and a 57% reduction in the WAM scenario. So again, in the WEM scenario, this includes a range of energy efficiency programs. In the WAM scenario, we have the additional district heating, and we also have the additional biomethane. Looking at the industrial processes sector now, so this sector is the emissions from the processes mainly associated with cement and lime industry in Ireland. We only have a with existing measure scenario for this. There are no additional measures that can be included for the sector. So we see that the growth forecast in the WEM is 4% between 2022 and 2030. There was quite a considerable drop in cement emissions in 2022, and that was shown in our 2022 inventory. And this reduction is shown across the across the full growth forecast. So there's no particular measures that are associated with this reduction. There was just less cement produced. Finally then, in terms of the sectors, we're looking at LULUCF. So increases in terms of LULUCF are projected in both the WEM and the WAM scenario, almost 100% increase in the WEM scenario from 22 to 2030 and 23% in the WAM scenario. So the WEM scenario includes lower forestation rates, so current forestation rates, which are 2,000 hectares per annum. In the WAM scenario, then we see higher afforestation rates as per the climate action plan. So that's 8,000 hectares of afforestation per year. And it also includes new measures that are included under LULUCF in the Climate Action Plan, including increases in hedgerows, return of manure to cropland, extended forestry rotation, and additional peatland rewetting also. So just to finish off then, I'll just go to recap on the key messages from today. So overall then, Ireland with additional measures scenario, so with all of the government planned measures, we're forecasting that a 29% reduction in emissions can be achieved, and that's versus our 51% Climate Act target. In order to achieve these, each of the measures needs to be completed, and each measure needs to achieve the saving that is attributed to it. In terms of our sectoral emission ceilings, we see that almost all sectors, apart from commercial and public buildings, and some other smaller sectors, including waste and F-gases, are projected to underperform relative to the sectoral ceilings. And each of the carbon budgets, as Tomas showed earlier, is projected to be exceeded. In terms of our compliance with EU targets, we are projecting that we're not going to meet our 42% reduction, even with the use of the flexibilities that are available to us. Thanks.